All right, good evening, everybody. All right, I got some feedback, so I guess this is working. Great. Good evening, my name is Jeff Nelson. I'm the Executive Director of the Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal, and we want to welcome you here to our event at Hope College tonight. Founded in 1995, the Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal seeks to educate the rising generation about the institutions, beliefs, and practices that are the foundations of Western civilization and of the American experience within it. Named after Russell Kirk, an acclaimed author of The Conservative Mind and an influential scholar who was awarded the Presidential Citizens Medal by Ronald Reagan and who the Michigan State Senate pronounced Michigan's greatest man of letters, the Kirk Center has achieved a national and, in fact, international reputation for advancing academic excellence and quality programming. Based in the village of Mecosta, Michigan, where Kirk wrote his important works, just an hour and a half north of here. I hope you all come and visit us sometime. As my mother-in-law, Annette Kirk, the founder of the Kirk Center, sitting up front, likes to say, always inviting people, and she is one of the most welcoming people in the movement in Michigan. Up in Mecosta, the Kirk Center is a unique residential research and study centers where students and faculty come for seminars or to reside for periods of time to conduct important research and writing that helps advance their careers and also helps all of us better understand foundational principles. Through all its programs, the Kirk Center aims to recover and renew those enduring norms and principles that Russell Kirk called the permanent things: the health of the family, inherited political institutions that ensure a measure of order and justice and freedom, a life of diversity and independence, humane learning, widespread possession of private property, the fashioning of a moral imagination, and the primacy of the transcendent in our lives. These permanent things draw us closer to the true, the good, and the beautiful, and they guarantee against arbitrary interference of the state. They are all central aspects of conservative thought. Through its Kirk on Campus program, the center brings engaging and accomplished thinkers, as you'll experience tonight, to campuses like Hope to address some of the most pressing issues of the day through the lens of perennial ideas. And that's precisely our goal this evening. I want to thank our co-sponsors here at Hope, the Political Science Department, and particularly Professor David Ryden, the Markets and Morality Program, and Dr. Sarah Estelle, and Hope College Campus Ministries. And now we have a special treat that the president of Hope College is with us here tonight, Matthew Skogens, and he's going to say a few words.
I just want to, just to clarify, I'm not a special treat, but my name is Matt Skogen. I have the incredible joy and incredible honor of serving as the president of Hope College, and on behalf of this institution that we call Hope, welcome. Welcome to Hope College. Thank you for being here. We are a place that wants to put big questions on the table and wrestle with big questions. We're a place that believes in showing your work. And in my opinion, we live in a world where too often people jump to the answer before going through the process of analysis. In the classroom, there's a term for that, jumping to the answer sheet without having done the work. And we call it cheating. And we don't believe in that. We believe in wrestling with big questions, and we're looking forward to doing that tonight. We're a place called Hope, and so as we wrestle with big questions, we do so with a mindset of hope. And for us at Hope, that means we believe in a God who is working not just on the redemption of souls, but also on the redemption of this world, on the redemption of creation. And so we put big questions on the table, we wrestle with big questions, and we do so with hope. And so we're excited to host this event, excited to have all of you here tonight. To really kick us off, I'm going to turn it over to Reverend Jennifer Ryden, who's going to open us with a word of prayer.
It's an honor to be here tonight. Folks, would you pray with me, please? Faithful God, in creation, you fashion us in your image. In Christ, you renew us in your love. Through the Holy Spirit, you welcome us into the fellowship of believers. We bow in gratitude before you. Lord, we are grateful for this time, for this place, and for this gathering, and so we pray Come by here, Lord. Come by here. We need you. We need your way of reconciliation. We need you to lend us resurrection imaginations. We need grace and truth. We need understanding. We need the permanent things. We need Christ, who is the revelation of your wisdom and the incarnation of your mercy towards us. We need Christ, who is the light that shines in the darkness, the one the darkness will never put away. And so, Lord, we're grateful for this discussion, and we pray that tonight these words offered by these good brothers would renew our minds, enliven our spirits, and put us on the path of Christ so that we would leave better able to live as your disciples in this old world, loving God and loving our neighbor. Lord, we confess that far too often our conversations distort your image, betray your love, disrupt your fellowship. Would that not be the case tonight? May this engagement be a grace, one that serves this community, and even more, one that serves the kingdom of our beautiful Savior. Lord, we say humbly and gratefully, we are your people and you are your God. Lord, you sit enthroned forever, so give strength to your people tonight and bless us with your peace. All these things we pray in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Okay, about ready to get things started. Last night, Jeff Paulette, Dr. Paulette, who many of you know, and Ian Rowe and I were at Calvin University, and we had a version of this program. And I didn't realize at the time, when Jeff and I were working on this with the Professor Micah Watson at Calvin, that we were instruments of institutional reconciliation between two pretty serious rivals. But they let us in, and they let Jeff in and gave us such a warm welcome. And some of them are here tonight as well. And we had a lot of fun. And so Jeff though, was not leading the discussion last night. So he has a wager with the Professor Micah Watson, who was his counter last night, as to who's going to get the prize for discussion leader of the week. So he's got some chips on the line tonight. But he rises to the occasion. Jeff Paulette, as you know, is a professor of political science here. He's the author of many works on American political thought, religion, politics, constitutional law. He's a senior fellow at the Kirk Center. He's our academic advisor. He's widely published author, a popular speaker, and he's going to lead us tonight. Jeff Paulette.
Take a second here while Chris moves the microphone. Our plan of action is to have a conversation for a while and then open the floor to audience questions. So when we get to that point, if you could just queue up by the microphone over there to ask your questions of our speakers. In addition to the thank yous that Jeff gave, I want to add my thanks to Jeff and Emily from the Kirk Center for organizing this event and for all the good work that they do. And I'd also like to thank Kim Fences, our departmental assistant, who did a lot of good work helping us setting up tonight's event. So thank you to all of you. With that, I'd like to introduce our guests tonight. To my immediate left here is Ian Rowe, who is a graduate of Brooklyn Technical High School, Cornell University, and an MBA from Harvard University. We regard those schools as nearly our equal, by the way.
As nearly?
As nearly our equal.
Oh,
so,
my God. They're safety schools.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. He is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on education and upward mobility, family formation, and adoption. Mr. Rowe is also the co-founder of Vertex Partnership Academies, a new network of character-based international baccalaureate high schools opening in the Bronx. He's the chairman of the board of Spence Chapin, a nonprofit adoption services organization, and the co-founder of the National Summer School Initiative. He concurrently serves as a senior visiting fellow at the Woodson Center and is a writer for the 1776 Unites campaign. Mr. Rowe was CEO of the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Before joining public prep, he was Deputy Director of Post-Secondary Success at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Senior Vice President of Strategic Partnerships and Public Affairs at MTV. And I should point out, by the way, when we were doing a Zoom call a couple months ago, I looked in the background and I said, "Are those Emmys in the background?" He goes, "Yeah, I won a couple Emmys when I was at MTV." So, oh yeah.
I did.
Director of Strategy and Performance Measurement at the USA Freedom Corps office in the White House, co-founder and president of Third Millennium Media. He's a co-host of the Invisible Men podcast, and his book Agency will be coming out in May. He also has 2 young children and comes to us from New York. From the other side of the country.
And the wife.
And a wife and 2 children. Yeah, that's my first slip up of the evening. It won't be my last. To my far left and from the other side of the country comes John Wood Jr., who was a graduate of Culver City High School and El Camino College, where he graduated in political science, which I remind everyone, according to Aristotle, is the highest of all the sciences. He is the National Ambassador for Braver Angels, a national grassroots nonprofit organization dedicated to the project of creating greater understanding and collaboration in our civic culture between Democratic and Republican voters. Braver Angels specializes in helping people engage respectfully in tough conversations. John volunteered for Barack Obama's 2008 presidential campaign, and in 2014 he was the Republican nominee for California's 43rd Congressional District, running against incumbent Democratic Congresswoman Maxine Waters. And I'll point out that he has had the highest vote of any challenger. Still got waxed pretty badly, but he did have the highest vote of any challenger. He is a board member of Strive Academics and Arts, a commenter for Black is Online, a contributing writer to Ariel and Quillette magazines, and has written for the Wall Street Journal. He also has a podcast, The John Wood Jr. Show, and he has been a guest on way too many podcasts to mention, always exceptional. I should point out that John's full name is John Randolph Wood Jr., and Russell Kirk's first book was on John Randolph of Roanoke, and we found out last night that John is actually named after John Randolph of Roanoke. He is also an amateur musician, and I recommend you go to the YouTube to hear his rendition of Sam Cooke's A Change Is Gonna Come, which I did listen to this morning. He is married with 3 children. I guess my first question to both of you is, when do you find time to sleep?
That is a good question.
I'd like to begin by giving both our speakers an opportunity to kind of set up some background for us about the work that they're doing, and then we'll launch into some question and answer. So, if you'd like to go first.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. I do recognize that I was at Calvin last night, and I guess that is taboo, but we're creating a balance, so that's very good. No, I'm looking forward to tonight's discussion and just this idea that we have to be able to have conversations about tough issues. The whole idea of viewpoint diversity, democratic discourse. We need more and more institutions like Calvin and Hope who are willing to bring folks like us into spaces like this where we can agree to disagree, and find common ground in space. And it's something I think about a lot because amongst that litany of things that I've done in my life, I do a lot of work with young people and how they can think about their own future amidst a world where there are all these competing forces that are sometimes creating a level of disillusionment as to what they can accomplish in their own lives. And for the last 10 years, I ran a network of public charter schools, all girls and all boys, elementary and middle schools in the heart of the South Bronx and the Lower East Side of Manhattan. We had about 2,000 students in our schools, almost all low-income students, almost all Black and Hispanic. students. But the common element was that their parents chose our schools because they wanted their kids to have a shot at the American dream. Each year when we ran our lottery, we accepted a couple hundred kids, but we had nearly 5,000 on our wait list. One of the most excruciating days, because here you have the joy of telling a certain number of kids, you got in, you got the golden ticket, and yet for nearly 5,000, the best we could say is that you're on this really long wait list. And so it really starts to, you think about these things a lot as someone who runs schools, and how do we get kids on even just the first rung of their path to prosperity? And after running public prep for 10 years, this is in a district in the South Bronx where only 2% of kids that started 9th grade in the year 2015, 4 years later, graduated from high school ready for college. Meaning that they started 9th grade and either dropped out somewhere along the way or actually did earn their high school diploma, but still couldn't do math nor reading without remediation if they were to go to college. So the state of high schools, and this isn't just in the South Bronx, this is in many areas across the country. So I am going back in and launching a new network of character-based international baccalaureate high schools that's opening in the Bronx this August. So I'm very excited about that. But as I observe, because I work with leaders across the country, just what is going on in the lives of young people, college students, and I've come to the conclusion that there are these two competing meta-narratives that, in my view, are impeding the ability for young people to see their own future, to see their ability to control their own destiny. These two meta-narratives I call, first is blame the system, and the other is blame the victim. In a blame the system narrative, that views America as this forever oppressive nation, that based on your skin color, based on your gender, some other immutable characteristic, you're inherently either an oppressor or you're oppressed, that forces like capitalism itself are evil, and that these forces are so strong, so discriminatory, that essentially the system is rigged against you. And that kind of ideology, if you're a young person, you feel pretty powerless because you don't have the unilateral ability to change these massive systems. So blame the system is very much of a top-down oppressive narrative unto itself. But blame the victim is actually almost the opposite, in which America is a land of opportunity. It's an incredible country. There are opportunities everywhere. And so if you're not successful, that must mean it's some pathology that you have. There's something that you did wrong. You didn't pull yourself up by the bootstraps. And so this blame the victim ideology just puts a young person in the position like, oh my gosh, what can I do? And so both of these, what I call these meta-narratives, are half-truths that add up to a lie. And I believe that young people need a new framework to navigate between these two narratives because they rob you of agency. They rob you of your ability, your belief that you can control your destiny. And I define agency as the force of your free will guided by moral discernment. The force of your free will guided by moral discernment. In a sense, agency is like a vector. So consider velocity. Velocity is not just speed, it's speed and direction. Right? So if all of us have the force of our own free will, where do we get the guidance to be able to make morally discerning choices? And that's the framework I'm putting forth. I call it a framework I call free. If we want a life of freedom, there are 4 pillars that I'm trying to revitalize and have young people embrace in a whole new way. And the reason I've created this framework essentially is to help young people learn that they can overcome institutional barriers that the blame the system people constantly say are insurmountable, while also saying that there are supports that they can receive that the blame the victim people constantly ignore. And so this framework I call FREE: family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship. Those are the 4 pillars that if we can surround young people with, I believe that you'll have a much greater chance of human flourishing. Very quickly, the first F is for family, not the family that you're from, it's about the family that you form. So for young people, as they think about the decisions that they're making as they enter into their own passage into young adulthood, understanding concepts such as the success sequence. Anyone ever hear of that term? Wow, very interesting. The success sequence basically says that if one finishes just their high school degree, gets a full-time job of any kind, just you learn the dignity and discipline of work, and if you have children, marriage first, that series of decisions, 97% of millennials that follow that pathway avoid poverty. That's an incredible set of data, which I think it's important for young people to understand, not as a prescription saying that you must do this, but as a description so that young people better understand what are the rewards and consequences associated with different series of life decisions. The R in FREE makes sense at a place like Hope College, is religion, the idea of having a personal faith commitment, even at a time where religiosity is in decline, particularly amongst young people. I mean, the fastest growing category, religious category amongst young people is called the nuns, which is N-O-N-E, unfortunately not N-U-N. But I think there's an opportunity for revitalization, especially when that religious fervor is actually being satisfied now, unfortunately, by some ideologies. Like John McWhorter has a great book called Woke Racism, where he actually even compares anti-racism, critical race theory as religions unto themselves. And so this void is being filled. The question is, what are we really empowering young people to believe in their lives? The first E within FREE is education. This idea that every young person should have the power to choose a great school for their education. And then finally, and again, we can talk all about these things. And the final E for entrepreneurship, if you've got a strong family, strong faith commitment, strong access to education, this idea of work and becoming a producer and an owner and understanding how you build wealth. In the network of schools I'm launching in August, each 9th grader, through a partnership with the Charles Schwab Company, will have a stock portfolio where they'll have fractional shares of Google, Apple, Walmart, so that they can understand if they have an iPhone, they're not just a consumer, they can actually be an owner. And what does that mean? And it's one of the ways we start to instill this idea that you can control your destiny. All these elements of establishing young people as producers and owners of their own future. So that's a framework I'd love to discuss tonight, but it's really what I've discovered in a lot of these discussions that are so contentious. Rarely, what you usually see is lots of, bashing, and not often a compelling alternative. That what is it that we can say yes to? If you're against X, then what is the Y that you're putting forth? And so this is my offering to say, here's a different way that young people can think about their lives and revitalize these pillars of family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship.
Indeed,
John.
indeed. Well, so let me follow on that, first of all, by making some reference to the work that I am engaged in, and possibly by identifying some philosophical and ideological currents that are at play in our society right now that I think lend some interesting context to some of the subject matter that brings us together here, and hopefully by the end of it we'll still have time to actually have the conversation, right? So I'll try and be efficient with my time. So I work for an organization, as you mentioned, Jeff, called Braver Angels, National Ambassador and Strategic Leader for that organization. It is the largest grassroots bipartisan organization in the country dedicated to the work of political depolarization, although I tend to deepen that description by saying that what we are really dedicated to is reviving the communal spirit of American democracy, if you will. And so we're a membership organization, 10,000 members across the country, 75 bipartisan local alliances. You can think of them as being akin to chapters. We have work unfolding in Congress, on college campuses across America, in media spaces, a fledgling digital media network, of which I'm a podcast host on, even work with singers and songwriters. We've got a community of musicians, about 150 strong or so, who participate in our programs. But we are rooted in grassroots and local communities, helping people in local PTAs, local schools, and even across their dinner tables find the capacity to empathize with one another's personal experiences in an effort to maintain the relationships without which the social fabric dissolves and our ability to maintain institutional life and democratic life evaporates, right? And so it's an interesting field to be in, because we wind up attracting many individuals, many folks across America, right, left, and center, who feel wounded by the modern state of our politics. And these are people who are inevitably coming from different walks of life, differing political perspectives, who find themselves, through our programs, through the networks we establish, coming into relationship with each other and sort of identifying and reckoning with the fact that even as our own particular sort of sufferings in the modern political context are characterized in our own experience by, the particular points of view and beliefs that we have. Oh, I'm a conservative. People around me at my school or in my office think I'm a racist because I voted for Donald Trump. Oh, I'm progressive. I support the LGBTQ community, and that makes me irredeemable in the eyes of, my parents or grandparents or what have you. Yet when we come together, we do discover that there is a shared sort of phenomenon of civic isolation and ostracization that's taking place, which overlaps over a larger sort of decline in the fabric of American community. Now, I'll mention a couple of other hats that I wear. I happen to be an advisor to the American Project out of Pepperdine School of Public Policy, which is dedicated to reviving the communitarian strand of the conservative movement. I also advise an organization called FAIR, the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. And I mention those two affiliations for two reasons. The first reason is that I was buried under the avalanche of Ian Rowe's accolades in that introduction a moment ago, and thought that I needed to sprinkle a little bit.
He's older than you are, though.
Exactly.
Yeah, a little bit older. I need to sprinkle a little bit more on my own resume. But I also want to point out that, these two organizations, which are, gaining traction in their own zones and spaces, are made up of folks who find themselves also somewhat, feeling somewhat alienated in the context of their own sort of native political tribes, if you will. And so, there are many conservatives in America who sort of lament the fact that the mainstream of the conservative movement has been, perhaps we can argue, so enthralled to the ethos of rugged individualism, the idea that we are folks who forge our own path through our own personal agency and do not wish as Americans to be sort of enveloped in the collectivist sort of, ideology of those who would reduce us merely to our class or our group characteristics, that we have forgotten perhaps the importance, the foundational significance of leaning into the relationships that allow us to be in community with each other, because after all, society is stitched together through communities, a community of communities, if you will. And therefore, the interpersonal ethos that allows us to be in relationship to each other may not be captured in a mere emphasis on individualism, and conservatism should have something to offer to the conversation about how do we reweave the fabric of community. And so you have conservatives who are banding together to make that case. Whereas on the other hand, my friends at FAIR, many of them, probably most of them, are disaffected liberals. liberals who see the advent of modern, third wave social justice or anti-racism as seeking to overwhelm society with a collectivist impulse that seeks to sort of respond to historic justices in a way that threatens to obliterate our individual characteristics, our individual qualities. Yes, I may be a white man. Yes, I may be an African American, but does that make me an oppressor? Does that make me a victim? Or am I somebody who exists in multiple dimensions as a human being, as an American, as somebody who is possessed of multiple different identities and perhaps overlapping experiences that generate the unique personal phenomenon which is me, right? Now, what this ought to tell us is the fact that ultimately it's possible to frame many of America's struggles as sort of landing in greater concentration or lesser concentration, one population or the other, but ultimately amounting to universal sort of human efforts to reckon with the naturally complex polarities of life in a modern, complicated democracy, right? And so part of what we must reconcile is the role of the individual versus the foundational commitments of community. And so when we ask the question, liberty or equity, it involves a context in which part of what we are trying to do in American life, broadly speaking, I believe, is maintain the sovereignty, maintain the foundational significance of individualism while also reckoning with this question, what are our collective and shared and communal obligations to one another? And so I want to offer that frame here very quickly, because I would argue that liberty and equity need not find themselves fundamentally in opposition to each other. And of course, as we were discussing earlier, Ian and Jeff, this does depend a little bit on how we define the term equity, so I think it would be great to get into that. But that ultimately, without understanding in a deep way the proper relationship that ought to exist between the individual and the community and the need for both, we will be fated to continue with the dysfunctional conversation between right and left, which dissolves into the worst sorts of name-calling and stereotyping and inability to grasp what is really seeking to be communicated by each side of our political discourse in a manner that will doom democracy if this is not righted. And so, there's no more important area of conversation in which to seek a more productive synthesis, if you will, of some of these concerns than this larger conversation over liberty and equity and how we reckon with matters of race and social justice. So I'm honored to share the stage with my friend Ian here and look forward to getting into the conversation with all of you.
Listening to the two of you with your opening statements, it seems to me that part of what you're touching upon is that the prospects for Black America in particular, relationships between blacks and whites in America more generally, hinges in part upon how we understand the prospects for America itself and what role, what future we see for our own country. And there you see, I think, a fair amount of pessimism. So for example, polling data we have on young people shows that patriotism is collapsing. Trust in institutions is almost non-existent. And so what sort of prospects for progress are there? Right, you can think of America either in a kind of jingoistic way as a sort of perfect, this goes to your two narratives thing, or as just a hopelessly corrupt sort of thing. Is there a way to think about American democracy in a kind of healthy, renewed sense that makes it compelling for people in such a way that we can actually make progress on the sorts of things that John was just talking about?
Well, I find it interesting when you started your question, you said, the sense of possibility for Black Americans or relationships between Black and white Americans. I don't start with that racial identity first, because I think that's part of the issue at times. We elevate certain elements of our identity which suddenly become the most salient characteristic. The new high school network we're launching later this year is organized around this idea of equality of opportunity individual dignity, and our common humanity. And these aren't just words. We literally want to play that out, that we will never reduce you to this characteristic of race or gender identity. You are this special human being that is made up of these multi-dimensional factors. And I think that's the element that we have to revitalize in our country. I mean, America's founding principles, and again, they weren't always practiced in the way that we all would like them to be. But it's an idea, this idea that there is a rugged individualism while there's a simultaneous recognition of the importance of these local mediating institutions, family, faith, again, my free framework. But there is this idea that agency is individually practiced but socially empowered. That we are all part of a larger fabric across race, across class, across gender. This honestly is why I run schools, to instill this idea, because I do see young people in particular being immersed in a world where they're being boxed into categories even before they've had a chance to figure out who they are. And I think that's what's fracturing us as a nation, because before we can even talk about common humanity, we're separated. There's a practice that's often been done in the name of equity. This room is, there are probably too many people, but imagine this were a classroom and we lined up every single person in this room on one long horizontal line. And it's called a privilege walk. Anyone know what a privilege walk is? All right, a couple of you. Okay, so in a privilege walk, for those of you who don't know, you might have a teacher at the front of the room who says, so everyone starts equal footing, but these questions are almost designed to create division and assumed privilege or assumed marginalization. So if you're white, take 3 steps forward. If you're black, take 6 steps backward. And this is a series of questions with all these heavy assumptions about your privilege or your oppression. So by the time of this exercise ends, you likely will have a group of white males on the front of the room and a group of lower income kids of color in the back, and this is supposed to be a constructive exercise? In fact, in Chicago, there's a case right now where there was a lesson plan where the purpose of the lesson was to have the white kids internalize their white supremacy, right? So that they would better understand this inherent privilege that they have. Those are the kinds of, they're not even well-intended. I used to ascribe, I used to try to give people the benefit of the doubt on this front, but those are the things that I think, these ideologies which clash with our core principles, that at base, America is this idea that we share this sense of humanity, dignity first, before we get to all these other dividing characteristics.
Indeed. I still try and give people the benefit of the doubt, but I will, certainly agree with Ian that this produces, I think, a bitter psychological effect. Practices such as these for many young people, because it's frankly, it's psychologically, I think, undermining to be sort of, labeled and identified as either the oppressor or the oppressed. If particularly it then becomes something that you carry with you as a matter of your own identity into the thickets of life. Having said that, though, I do also think that it's vital for us to reckon with the context in which we arrive at these difficult conversations. And it's a very difficult thing in many respects to disentangle, None of us is merely black. None of us is merely white. And what do these terms mean anyway? There's a way in which, I certainly, can feel a deep sort of resonance with the impulse to say it would be better to just sort of do away with racial categories altogether, because ultimately our common humanity ought to transcend these categories, and it does, right? And certainly if we believe that we are made in the image of God, well then, we have a source of identity that would seem to be quite a bit more significant morally and spiritually than that which is ascribed to us by these social constructs, right? That are racial categories. On the other hand, we all come into these conversations trailing history behind us, and I never want to give history short shrift. I think that a great deal of the larger fervor for modern anti-racism, for social justice, for a desire to see to it that a country that, on its face and to many appearances would seem to have achieved, a degree of sort of larger equality between the races that could produce our first African-American president, not to mention artists and athletes and celebrities of all ilks who come from all colors, and certainly summoned forth from the African-American community, that there's a deep fervor to nevertheless sort of challenge our assumptions about the character of our country on the basis of the fact that many people feel that the real work of equity, of equality, and justice is left undone in America, and that we are complacent with a society that is still grossly unequal, but not just grossly unequal, but sort of wickedly unjust in how it treats many of its citizens. Now, this is a perspective that one can write off, but it's worth sort of engaging with the complexities of American society as it actually exists to try and distill the perverse motivations for sort of capitalizing on our social fears for the purposes of building up, sort of a virtue signaling kind of, platform for oneself versus the real experiences of people who may actually be not fully sort of enfranchised in terms of having the opportunities that Ian is describing to reach the American dream. And so are there ways that we can sort of go about thinking about the difference here in a way that lends some clarity to the issue? Let me start with my own life here. I'm African American. I'm half African American. My father is white. My mother is black. When I was running for Congress, I had a canned opening line. Anybody who follows me here will likely have heard it. But when I was running against Maxine Waters, whether I was speaking to a black Democratic church in South Central Los Angeles or a white Tea Party club in South Bay LA County, people would ask me, what at the age of 26 or 27 makes you qualified to represent a district as diverse and complex as the California 43rd? And I would say, well, I've come from an interesting family background. My mother is a liberal black Democrat from inner city Los Angeles. My father's a conservative white Republican from Tennessee. I grew up explaining my father to my mother to my father, and that's why I can represent all of you. And it tended to, tended to get a laugh, right? But that was also sort of the frame of my existence. I mean, full disclosure, my father didn't officially become a Republican or self-identified conservative until a bit later in life, but he raised me talking about traditional American values. He raised me with Southern nostalgia, stories of Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone, sat easily alongside stories of Muhammad Ali and Willie Mays, My grandfather owned Dot Records in the 50s and the early 60s. That was Pat Boone's record label. So, I met Pat Boone as a young kid. On my mother's side, one of my uncles is Mac 10 from the West Side Connection, which was Ice Cube's group after he left NWA. So, from Pat Boone to Mac 10, you get me sort of in the middle in terms of my upbringing. Now, when I was 5 years old, 6 years old, 5.5, 1992, we had the LA riots after the beating of Rodney King. And that exists as a bit of a faint blip in my memory. I mean, I do sort of remember it. I remember being a kid and seeing my father pacing back and forth in the living room. And I remember, images on the TV, on the news that were worrying and concerning. And later on, my dad would tell me that on one of those days, my mother left the house to go to work. And as she drove down the street, Dad said to himself, Jesus, he said, why did I let her go? I may never see her again. Again, we were in suburban, multicultural, we were in suburban Culver City, suburban city in Los Angeles. And there was some scary stuff happening in pockets of Culver City. My mother came close to it, had a bit of a nerve-wracking experience, but ultimately came home and was okay. The woman that I would marry years later, at that very same time, was 4 years old. She lived 15 minutes and 15 miles away from me in the Jordan Downs projects in Watts. And her experience of the LA riots was the experience of being a little girl trapped in a war zone, gunshots, laying on the floor because bullets might whiz through the window, screams, sirens, fire, people coming in and out, of her door. And the knowledge of the fact that the police could do nothing to protect them, and that all this happened, in fact, because police officers had beaten an innocent man who looked like her father, who looked like her uncle, who was somebody from their community, and now the community itself was going up in flames. My wife's American experience begins in a domestic war zone. And over the course of her life, living in the projects, living in deep in the hood in South Central, or in the projects is its own ecosystem. Even within that urban area, she has seen more death and violence than some people have seen serving in Iraq and Afghanistan. I put that forward as a literal statement. This is her American experience. Now, we're both black. We're both African Americans. In the aftermath of the Civil Rights Movement, just to give you a little bit of quick history, you had a situation where many African Americans, integrated major institutions in American life. You had many black people who were brought into the universities, brought into the entertainment industry, brought into politics, who integrated suburban communities, suburban neighborhoods that they hadn't had the opportunity to move into before. Martin Luther King Jr.'s integrationist dream, his nonviolent vision, changed so much of our culture, touched the heart of America. And so for many African Americans, there were pathways to success and relationship with white Americans that weren't there before. And for many white Americans, those are the only black faces that they ever really see up close. Oftentimes black faces like my own. But for millions and millions of other African Americans, life did not change. As a matter of fact, life got quite a bit worse in quite a few ways. Jim Crow segregation was a phenomenon of the South, but by the time Dr. King, lived and died, most African Americans had already moved out of the rural South. Most African Americans were already inhabiting America's urban cities. And what happened at that point? You have the evaporation of economic opportunities. Of course, manufacturing opportunities declined as the factories outsourced jobs to China and otherwise moved production to the suburban outskirts, leaving the sort of centers of occupation barren and industrial centers. You had more perniciously the advent of crack cocaine, preceded by heroin, and a situation in which I would argue many African Americans had found some subsistence sort of income, engaging with the public benefit system, the Great Society, the welfare state, if you want to use the term, but in the absence of economic opportunity, found themselves in a circumstance wherein the pathway towards social mobility within your own ecosystem was something that suddenly became determined by your ability to engage in acts of violence, to be able to engage with this substance that was destroying family and creating an ecosystem of death and despair. And on top of that, you get the phenomenon of mass incarceration. And over a short period of time, the prison population booms from about 200,000 to 2 million or so. And the thing to understand about that figure, against the backdrop of which you've got 10,000 African Americans more or less dying a year in drug and gang-related violence, in communities in slums that were developed as a part of the architecture of public policy that saw to it that for many, many decades, and this technically was meant to end with the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968 or so, but for most of American history, black people were not allowed to integrate into broader American neighborhoods, and so concentrated in inner city centers. You have to look at each one of these deaths, each one of these incarcerations, as not just affecting an individual, but affecting a family, affecting a neighborhood, affecting an entire community, right? And so it's that chain of history that my wife is born into, right? And you fast forward just a few years, many of the people who were incarcerated in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s find themselves released in the late 90s and the early 2000s, the 2010s, with a mark on your record owing to policies of incarceration that right and left, many of us consider to be unjust now. They now find themselves unable to re-enter the workplace, never going to have the opportunity to get a college degree, more likely than not, unable to provide for their families and faced with the choice of being able to engage in criminality once again in the absence of the support structures that Ian is mentioning. Therefore, I ask the question, at what point does the American dream actually show up for so many African Americans in this country whose life circumstances are different from mine? Now, clearly I'm making a case here that this isn't quite as simple as black and white. This is a class issue. This is a matter of great complexity, and as soon as we try to say that this is just a function of being black in America, we lose sight of black folks like myself. But as soon as we say that people are just being hysterical, when they get loud about matters of social justice, we lose sight of black people like my wife, right? Who really did endure things that I could never imagine. And so, it is in this context that the solutions that Ian puts forward have to be reckoned with not just as things that are straightforward answers to difficult problems on the ground, but solutions that summon us to mobilize communities to be able to effectuate. I have I don't have overwhelming confidence in the federal government's ability to address all of these issues. I think the federal government plays an important role, but civil society, our willingness to marshal the philanthropic sector, the business sector, to be able to launch community-based organizations, schools that give parents choice, gang and violence prevention programs. I've seen statistics that say that for every city of 100,000 people during this period of time spanning from 1985 to 1995, where violence and homicide was at its peak in American life, for every community-level organization launched in that period of time, and they flowered going into the early and the mid-90s, you had a reduction in the homicide rate of an average of about 1% or so, which is many, many lives saved, right, on the basis of communities mobilizing to solve their own problems. But we should be helping communities to find those answers, and that should be a focus of the conservative movement. Is it? Or are we content to let Ian do all the work and say Democrats in the meanwhile ought to be cutting taxes? So let's be real about it, and let's dig into the complexity and understand that no, we cannot give way to people who in a zeal for change upend the foundations, of liberal democracy. But at the same time, let's listen for the signal and the noise, and understand that we could be doing better too in how we engage these issues. So hopefully I didn't go too long, but there you go.
One thing that often gets packaged with critical theory and so forth is a dismissal of bourgeois values. Yeah. But in some ways, I hear you both articulating what some might disparage as bourgeois values. I mean, is that an inherent part of the American dream? Is that, is that something that we should dismiss lightly, or is it something that we should take more seriously than what we do?
I mean, I think the core founding principles that America is based upon are under assault. Probably the best evidence of this is the New York Times, which nearly 3 years ago produced something called the 1619 Project, in which it was a special magazine issue, and they made some pretty powerful claims that, first of all, the country's founding wasn't even 1776, it was 1619, that the country was founded as a slaveocracy and not a democracy, and that the founding principles were, quote, false when they were written, and that every negative outcome for blacks today or other marginalized groups ties back to the country's history of racialized oppression. I mean, Nicole Hannah-Jones, who's the architect was the architect of the 1619 Project, wrote an 8,000-word essay called "What We Are Owed," and this is her treatise on why the system is so rigged against black people that the only solution was for the government to pass a $13 trillion reparations program. And in this essay, she says, there is nothing a black person can do. It doesn't matter if you get educated, doesn't matter if you buy a home, doesn't matter if you get married, doesn't matter if you save. None of those things can overcome, quote, 400 years of racialized plundering. And by the way, let's just state for the record that Nicole Hannah-Jones in her own life has done all of those things and has done extremely well, as have a lot of black and other people who have embraced the founding principles. And that's where I just, it boggles my mind when I see, and it's really this hypocrisy that bothers me, that we have to figure out a way that we can both acknowledge real atrocities in America's history while also recognizing the importance of the founding principles as the vehicle through which the embrace of has been the mechanism by which whole groups of people have moved from persecution to prosperity. And that's what I want to talk to our students about all the time. And history is important. I mean, the way that the New York Times 1619 Project frames American history, in my view, is in this very cherry-picked, negative, because look, if you want to paint a horrific picture of the United States of America, there's lots of terrible examples that you can weave that story. Yeah. Simultaneously, you can also create a very sanitized version, and that's not fair either, right? Warts and all. Warts and all. I'm part of a group, and actually John has worked as well with Bob Woodson, who's an incredible civil rights leader. When the New York Times 1619 Project came out with an actual curriculum, so they weren't just satisfied with a magazine issue. They wanted to bring these ideas, the founding principles were false when they were written. They wanted to bring these ideas to some of the poorest school districts across the country, so they created a curriculum. So in Buffalo, Rochester, Chicago, some of the poor, districts where literacy rates are in the single digits, they brought this curriculum, and so we worked with Bob to craft a curriculum. So the way you fight bad ideas is not to cancel or shout them down. You fight bad ideas with better ideas, right? So we created something called the Woodson Center 1776 Unites curriculum, which in our view has a more expansive, complete story of the African American experience in the United States. Many stories that haven't been told. That curriculum has now been downloaded more than 30,000 times by teachers in all 50 states, in traditional public schools, charter schools, private schools, religious schools, home schools, after schools, to create this compelling alternative. And just one example, this past year we celebrated, or celebrated is not the right word, but 100 years since the Tulsa Massacre. If many people are familiar with this, again, horrific event, and people say, see, this is an example of we haven't taught the real history of this country. That's what we need to teach our kids. And so we said, okay, let's teach the Tulsa Massacre. So we teach it in 3 segments. The first segment is the incredible level of entrepreneurship and business creation that the black community was able to achieve under intense racial discrimination. Why was there a Black Wall Street in the first place to be burned down, which is the second component of this unit, which tells this horrific, terrible story, which is then preceded by the third unit, which is the rebuild of that community after these atrocities occurred. In our view, you've got to put all of this stuff into context and just tell the complete story. And that's where I feel we're falling down, because the politicization of all of these topics. If you look at history through a contemporary lens, where you have either a blame the system ideology, you will pick out those elements that reinforce this idea that America is permanently racist. And that's where I think these kinds of dialogue are very important to have, to show that, okay, yes, these things happened. And, your wife's history, you can empathize with someone why they might have a view of America. And that's why it's on us to help expand that view without diminishing or dismissing. When George Floyd was, murdered, 2 years ago, regardless of the statistics of the incredibly rare instances of someone who's black, who's killed by a police officer's numbers. I think last year there were maybe 11 incidents in which unarmed black person was killed by a white police officer, which doesn't mean, by the way, that the person wasn't still guilty of a crime, but just to give you a sense of those numbers. But when that incident occurred, regardless of the data, suddenly every black person in America was George Floyd, and every police officer was the police officer that perpetrated, and that's a narrative. Then suddenly we're no longer human beings anymore. We're just avatars of these narratives, and we have to fight through that. And for those of us who want to really discuss these nuances, you have to recognize that the New York Times is not normally printing this kind of nuance, and so we have to think of those creative ways to be human, to share these stories, to not dismiss very real experiences, while also challenging and expanding perspectives in a way that hopefully honors our humanity and our dignity.
So those are very weighted terms, right, with a long history, and they certainly have a kind of religious foundation to them in a lot of ways. So as we begin to try to get traction on some of these problems, what role do you gentlemen see for religion in general, organized and personal, but Christianity in particular, in kind of moving us forward on some of these questions and creating possibilities for progress?
Yeah, indeed. To my mind, there is no way to ultimately get over this hill if faith is not a part of the equation, and if the substance of what I take to be the wisdom of the gospel is not instantiated in one form or fashion or the other, perhaps in various ways, in the body of our conversation over race, over democracy, over justice. Starting with the understanding that, when we talk about, American society or any other society, and when we talk about history, we are talking about fallen human beings. We are talking about imperfect people, all of us, black, white, otherwise, right? It is remarkable to me that democracy works as well as it does. Man, it's remarkable to me that everybody doesn't just crash into each other on the freeway, to tell you the truth. I'm always sort of, amazed by the fact that we can drive in the lanes, and yet, people can do it when we respect each other, when we work together, so on and so forth. But we seem to have this expectation, to throw the frame back on history again, of our ancestors, that, for some reason our ancestors should have lived up to our 21st century standards, for what constitutes sort of a moral or enlightened sort of disposition. When naturally our ancestors had to make the mistakes that they made and go through the experiences that they went to simply for us to be able to learn from those mistakes in our present day, right? And of course, we don't all live, again, sort of in the same historical frame, even in the present moment. We're all in the process of learning from each other in real time. And given that that is the case, grace has to be the lubricant of our social interactions. And because we have, for those of us who either are Christians or who at least take inspiration from the Christian tradition, we have a Savior, we have a model who helps to embody and demonstrate sort of the lived power, if you will, of grace and forgiveness in his example. Now again, look, I'm not saying that anybody has to, believe literally in the resurrection, this, that, or the other. I'm happy to stay another hour if y'all want to talk theology, but I think that you get the point that I'm making, right? if this just becomes a never-ending sort of ego competition between the political sides, wherein bad incentives are baked into the political parties and the media, and everybody benefits in the short term by destroying American democracy until democracy finally is destroyed, well, then that's just the route that we're going to go. We're going to capitalize on our divisions until there's nothing left to capitalize on. But if we are to pay heed to the teachings, not just of the gospel, but of Martin Luther King Jr., who obviously took his inspiration from the scriptures and also from the example of Mahatma Gandhi and so forth, who said that what we seek is a beloved community, and that we do not seek to defeat or humiliate the white man. We do not seek to defeat or humiliate our opponents, but to be reconciled to him in friendship by winning his understanding, right? So that we can be one together in the beloved community. If we don't embrace a transcendent ethic of understanding and forgiveness, which is the morally righteous thing to do, I might add, because none of us are so much better than folks on the other side that we ought to spend all of our time judging them and none of our time listening to them, then there's no way we can move forward, as a country, as one people out of many one. We have to be willing, all of us, left, right, and center, but without waiting for the other side, we have to be willing to go first and extending humility and grace and look to the prophets, look to the apostles, look to Christ as ready examples in terms of what that means, being willing to set pride aside and to love your neighbor, to love your enemy, even if that involves, having to take a lash or two in the process. In the long run, that'll be how we preserve democracy for the next generation.
Yeah, I think it's Karl Marx who is credited with the statement, if God didn't exist, people would create one. I think that's attributed to him. And I've always found that an interesting statement because it speaks to almost this inherent desire for human beings to seek some belief. And so this may be a bit strange, but I think there's a religious fervor that every person seeks to fill, and the question is, how is that void being filled? And I think when we talk of faith and everything you just described, we're thinking of more of a traditional, with Christianity, Buddhism, an enduring set of principles that have been lived with us for eons. But in the contemporary America, where traditional religiosity is declining, that same search for a set of beliefs that you can really anchor yourselves in still exists. And I think, unfortunately, for a lot of young people, again, go back to this idea of woke racism, critical race theory, it's almost as if those, and this is what John McWhorter argues, it's like these beliefs are becoming a religion unto itself. You can become excommunicated if you don't literally believe every single tenet of these ideologies. And that's what's really scary. So it's sort of like it's not Christianity, it's something else that's filling this need. And again, I feel like young people in particular need to see a compelling alternative, because it may be that more young people have been growing up in more fractured families, which may have been the institution through which they may have learned a set of core values, or they may have grown up in a community where church-going was not the norm, so the set of values that they would normally have gotten through that institution. So when we have these fractured institutions, the question is, where is, again, agency, the force of your free will, guided by moral discernment? So whether it's Christianity, Buddhism, I understand why you would want to focus on Christianity, but we need a reawakening. This transcendence that is, it's fundamental to humanity. And by the way, a good sign, just yesterday, the New York Times actually had an article about a new book called God, Grades, and Graduation, which actually talks about the power of faith to improving academic outcomes in young people. So maybe that's a glimmer of hope, but I think I very much agree with John that without a deliberate effort to a spiritual reawakening around faith, both personal faith commitment and faith-based organizations playing their proper role, it's very hard to see how massive government interventions or policies are single-handedly going to help encourage more young people in particular to lead the lives of flourishing that are more likely to occur with a faith commitment than without.
And that sort of goes to what you said earlier, right? That you fight bad ideas with better ideas, and right, you fight substitute religions with true religions.
Can I steal that line?
Absolutely.
Yes.
I probably stole it from someone myself. So.
Right. No, that's a great line. You fight substitute religions with true religion. I'm going to use that.
Okay.
But that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And the thing that in our current society, many of us who are actually benefiting from leading a life that is guided by following a true religion have to have the courage to say that out loud. Because what also seems to be happening is that you're kind of shunned by saying that my faith is important to me. Maybe that doesn't exist at Hope because of your institution, but at many institutions across the country, particularly colleges, a young person, it feels almost ashamed to talk about the role of God in their life. And I strongly encourage you to have the courage to share that, even in a context in which others might say that, oh my God, why are you, that's not cool.
Oh my God, why are you talking about God?
Yes, yeah.
And which God is that? Yeah.
No, it's very important.
Yeah.
Courage. Anyway.
Yeah. I think that's a good point to turn over question asking to the audience. If you want to queue up by the microphone over here by Dr. Nelson, please try to keep your questions as questions, not speeches. And
we had many questions last night, so if you don't
Hope,
want Calvin
Hope
to...
students, you have to do better than the Calvin students.
Yes.
And ideally, we'd like a student to go first.
Yeah. We almost went a full hour afterwards answering questions.
In fact, we have a student who's right by the microphone there.
Yeah, so the bar... so the bar is high.
Not everybody at once. Really, nobody has a
I
question.
take it that we answered all of your questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There we go.
Poor thing, she had to come all the way from the back.
Yeah, it's Therese. Yeah.
You need a question.
Yes.
Wow, I'm short. Okay. Basically, you were talking about faith in institutions. So what advice would you give students who go to public universities where faith is not emphasized in an institutional level to be reawakened, right? Or reawakening their peers?
Well, I think even if you're at a public institution, and even though faith may not be spoken of explicitly, my sense is there's still some religious community that you can seek out. Hope is not lost. I think...
Not yet.
All right. That was I didn't even make that connection. Hope is not lost. Never. But this does call faith-based leaders to become more proactive in the current moment. I think the faith community actually, to some degree, should face some level of indictment here, because there are a lot of arguments happening in our society for which faith-based leaders could step in with a sense of moral strength, respect, dignity in ways that maybe others may not. So when we're talking about the country's, false principles or people of certain skin colors are inherently X or Y. It's actually the religious community that can address those arguments in ways that could really, I think, crush those arguments in ways, but for some reason, and I don't know if it's faith leaders have fallen into the cancel culture themselves. So if you're a young person, and this is why, the blame the victim ideology, I never want to completely put it all on young people, or why aren't you establishing a faith commitment? Partly is because the institutions themselves, we aren't actually playing the proactive role that we should, and frankly have played throughout American history. If you look at most of the civil rights achievements, many social justice movements, it's actually been faith leaders who've been at the forefront, and for some reason there's a silence happening now that I think is short-shrifting young people to make that person feel isolated on a public campus.
And the only other small thing I would add to that is that, all ministry, all evangelism, so to speak, need not be loud or explicit or conspicuous. Be the type of person who wins the admiration of others, right? By dint of your character, by virtue of who you are, by virtue of your virtue, right? Be somebody who's compassionate, somebody who's understanding. Be somebody who's honest, somebody who is courageous, who has moral courage. Be somebody who serves, who gives back, somebody who can hold his or herself up with confidence, the confidence that comes with knowing you are loved by God. And then when people ask you what's your secret, you can testify to them that it is the light of the Lord within you, right, that allows you to be who you are. And when people see that, they evaluate you not by the words that you speak, but by the work that you do. And that becomes the greatest testament to your faith of all.
Preach the gospel always, if necessary, use words. Right?
There you go.
Right.
My name is Cameron Chamberlain. I'm a freshman, and I was wondering how potentially both of your ideas relate to equality, because both of them seem to be pushing towards the same thing, but they both have very different names, and I was wondering how you would stitch them together.
Equality or equity, or both?
Equality, not equity.
How do you define equity?
Equity is everyone gets the same number of boxes. Equity is everyone gets the number of boxes they need to see over a fence. Equality is everyone gets the same number of boxes.
And
I think he's taking you as the liberty guy and me as the equity guy, by the way. We had this conversation earlier about the framing of this event, because it did sort of, give a bit of a sort of like a me versus Ian kind of like battle royale over which, but I hear you saying sort of how do the two converge in terms of equality, right? And I think I would just say very quickly that, equality, a lot of these things are more difficult to define as you sort of, as you try and drill into it. Freedom is sort of notoriously difficult to sort of define because it naturally comes with constraints. It naturally comes with rules and limitations. But what I would say is that ultimately, I think their version, there's a way of understanding equity which sort of amounts to sort of like a socialized redistribution and an equality of outcomes, which, I think is what plenty of people mean by it. It's something I take some issue with, but I think that there's sort of a saving construction of the term equity, if you will, that really sort of gets to the idea that if I labor in America, if I work hard, I should be able to have a portion of the American dream that matches the efforts I put into it. I should be free to be able to make what I want of my life in a way that requires me to abide by the rules and structures of society, but that does not put unnecessary barriers in front of me as a consequence of the color of my skin or whatever my identity might be. And insofar as equality of opportunity is sort of the goal, or rather just sort of an equal standing to be able to pursue the American dream, whether you get fabulously rich or even better, have the wealth of a happy family at home, right, and the respect of your neighbors, then, the liberty to invest in your efforts, your labors in American life in a manner that produces an equitable return is sort of the formula that ties together the concepts of liberty and equity in a way that honors the good of equality at the end of the road. So that's one formulation I might offer in answer to the question.
And I don't know if we displayed that equality versus equity chart, but I think definitions are important. So I think the gentleman said his definition of equity was that every person gets what they need in order to be able to see over the fence. And as someone who runs schools, so I'm much more of a proponent of equality of opportunity than I am equality of outcomes, partly because I think equality of outcomes is a top-down ideology, which is more of a sort of a neo-Marxist, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. And this idea of who is this mythical figure who's deciding that based on some immutable characteristic, I'm going to take away from you because you have some privilege, and you're going to get more because you have some marginal element of your character. That, in my view, is not in line with freedom. Freedom actually accepts the possibility that outcomes will be different, that we do want every kid to get what they need in order to have a level playing field of opportunity, not necessarily to achieve the same outcome. It may seem like a subtle difference, but it's a very, very important element of, I think, what our country is based upon. So in a classroom, if you have 20 kids in a classroom, you'll have 20 different learning styles, right? So it's the job of the teacher to actually customize the interaction with that student so they're doing the best that they can to maximize that student's opportunity for learning. That's very different than equity. That's actually trying to create equal access, equal opportunity, and I think that's where these definitions really matter. When I went to Harvard Business School, the word equity was actually something defined very differently, because equity then meant you had the opportunity to have a piece of a company or have ownership in an enterprise of unlimited potential. So equity was something really, really great because it was unlimited in what you could achieve versus what I think it is often described as today, which is, quote, the absence of difference in outcomes. That's not something that can just be achieved, or that can't be achieved through a bottom-up structure where you're allowing everyone to be able to live up to their God-given potential.
Awesome, thank you so much. My name is Logan. I'm a junior here at Hope College. And Dr. Rowe, you mentioned, in the polls that people are losing patriotism. And I'm just interested, what do you think is a true patriotism, or what are the options available to people of what patriotism is? I think for me, it's really just been, C.S. Lewis talks about a love of home, and he sort of equates that to a love of country. So I was just wondering what your thoughts, and this is sort of a peripheral issue, but I think it can be related to the main discussions.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. At Braver Angels, we use a phrase that I coined originally called patriotic empathy, which I define as meaning that your love for your country is demonstrated through your concern for your neighbor, right? I think that there are plenty of different ways of loving America, just like there are plenty of different ways of loving somebody who you might be romantically inclined towards. You might love a person for their body. You might love a person for how they look. But then, if that's as deep as your love goes, is it really love at all? I mean, there are many people who love America because America is great, but how do we define greatness? If we're merely defining it in material terms, if we're defining it in terms of our GDP, the size of our military, well, these are assets, but if these assets aren't deployed in service of a moral culture, then, they might as well be immoral themselves, because that's likely the ends to which wealth and power will eventually be deployed. I would like to think that patriotism seeks, obviously, the material prosperity of America and the moral leadership of America throughout the world, but on the basis of the fact that we've crystallized deep moral commitments here at home, and that we embody these commitments in the relationships that we have with one another. across our political, religious, and various other divides, as members, ultimately, of the larger American community. So if there's not a deep moral dimension to your patriotism that equates our greatness with the integrity of these moral commitments, then, I'm afraid that any other definition of patriotism is rather shallow by my reading. So that's the type of patriotism I go in for.
And I would just add, we try to have our students recognize that America is a good, if not great, country. But the journey between good and great is a journey for which our students are not passive players. They are part of what makes this country great. They're not just an observer. And I think this is de Tocqueville's, observation of Americans, that we were a problem-solving nation. When we see issues, we create these associations. That's what I think it's so important to instill in young people, that America isn't like this entity out there for which I am patriotic in this thing. I'm of this thing, and I have the ability to make it better. And for me, that's what engenders patriotism, when you are actually confronting those elements of America. I mean, I run schools in the heart of the South Bronx. There are a lot of things that I could look at and become very depressed and feel that this is a horrific nation. But the fact that I'm running schools in these neighborhoods and seeing lots of other people who want to join that effort, that actually makes me very patriotic, because I'm involved in the process of moving this country to this idea of a more perfect union. And so that's how I would define patriotism and how you become more patriotic.
Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Katie. I'm a senior. Thank you so much for your thoughts. I was just wondering what advice you might have for students who are looking to interact with their peers on nuanced issues, but their peers have been intensely affected by the ideological issues that you mentioned earlier. Thanks.
Oof.
Well, this is kind of my line of work. Can I?
Nope. Yeah, go right ahead.
Weigh in here. Look, whether you're someone on the left speaking to somebody on the right, or vice versa, I think that there's certain principles of communication that are worth developing, and we teach them at Braver Angels. So, if you don't mind me working in a plug here, Jeff, I do encourage folks to go to braverangels.org if you're interested in learning about some of these practices and possibly getting involved yourself as a member. But I'll answer at two levels. The first is tactical. We have a formulation that we teach in one of our workshops called LAPP, L-A-P-P. And so it goes like this. Listen, right? You want to start off in the conversation after you get things rolling by listening earnestly and attentively to what the other person has to say, not listening to respond, right? Not listening to score a point as if in a debate, but listening to genuinely hear and to hear the emotional content and origins of what that person is saying. Second step is acknowledge. You want to acknowledge what the other person has just said, but in terms that resonate with how they themselves likely understand their own point of view. And so you could take the route of characterizing somebody, like let's say if somebody is pro-choice, you might say, okay, so you just don't care about unborn babies then, right? But that's probably not what's going through that person's head. That person probably has an affirmative belief in the right of women to be able to choose what they do with their own bodies because they believe in gender equality. And so if you were to use words along those lines, so I hear you saying you're pro-choice because you believe in the rights of women, you believe that a woman has the right to determine, how she lives her life without the state or a man telling her what to do. You acknowledge that in terms that will allow them to say, okay, this person is actually hearing me. Then you pivot. You say, well, I have a somewhat different point of view, or I have a different experience. Now, you could just say something like, well, as a matter of fact, what you're saying is morally ignorant, or it's just a fact that, what you're saying is tantamount to murder or whatnot. You can say that, but that delivers the conversation in the direction of competition, where you are not hearing that person, will not hear you. But when you introduce that I statement, you're introducing a note of humility. You're saying, well, this is my experience, right? This is my perspective. tied to, the way I've traveled through life. And that doesn't mean the person's gonna suddenly be ready to agree with you, but it means that you're emphasizing that common humanity, which makes it worth it for that person to continue the conversation. And then you offer your perspective, this is why I'm pro-life. It just, for example. So that simple formulation is important, but more important even than that is maintaining an internal disposition of charity and goodwill towards the other party. The philosophy of nonviolence rests on the idea that love is a spiritual force that can be applied to social questions. When you love the person who is angry at you, and when you're able to nurture a feeling of love within yourself towards that person, it can be a hard thing to do. Not saying it's, not, but, again, it helps when you have support from on high. That begins to animate the tone of your voice, and the nature of your behavior. It's when the internal dialogue gets scrambled and we give in to, reactive, hateful sentiments towards the other party, that it just sort of spills out like vomit in our conversations. And then we spiral down, So spiritual discipline is difficult, but it will see you through. Mm-hmm. You're welcome.
That's braverangels.org.
There you go.
Hi, I'm Abby. I'm a senior. My question for both of you is just, what is your advice for dealing with people who put their identity, whether that's racial or some political issue, as the forefront of how they deal with things? And what do you think the role of localism is in that?
And what's the role of?
Localism.
Localism. Interesting. What do you do when you have people who, I'm gay, Well, as a black person, I listen. For me, because I try very much not to box myself into certain categories, I very much try not to do that to other people. But I do start with this premise of maybe I'm wrong. I think you should try to say that to yourself a couple of times. Mm-hmm. What if I'm actually wrong? Actually accept that possibility. Just for a moment. Think that you're not the complete sage, that you don't know everything. Maybe this person has a point, right? And actually try to listen. If someone comes at me with, well, I'm black, so therefore X, or I'm, I ran for school board in my town of Pelham because I felt the school was moving in a direction where the school leadership was starting to treat kids in a way that they were no longer individual students. They were now just avatars of some marginalized identity. And so I've actually had several discussions with the superintendent on this topic. And I said, when you say, because there was a letter that went around, a particular incident, and something about we have to be careful for our marginalized students. And so I heard it and I said, I think I understand that you're trying to demonstrate a level of empathy for a certain group of kids, but what do you think the impact is if a set of kids keeps hearing everyone describe them as marginalized? What do you think that effect is over time? And then I try to share the experiences that I've had with kids who have had that label placed on them, and I try to find a way. It's doing what John said, which is not cutting off the conversation, trying to be empathetic, trying to be understanding, and again, accepting that maybe you've got something to learn. But I generally find that if you get past it's almost like someone's trying to virtue signal to you in the sense of, I'm gay because I really want to establish that this is an important part of their identity. Okay, that's cool. I mean, I respect you because I think you're human. It's not because you're gay or because of your skin color. I respect you because of your, and it's almost as if they're looking for a fight in a sense. And so if you just say, okay, that I'm with that. Can we now move on to whatever the substance is of the conversation? It's almost as if you don't match their prioritization of their identity because it's not really that relevant necessarily to what it is that you're trying to discuss. I know it's a lot easier for me to say these things, and when you have someone in front of you who's insisting on a certain level of recognition. But so much of this for me comes down to recognition of our common humanity and not wanting to just box you in to a certain category.
Can you add to what you meant by localism, just very, very quickly?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering what you think the role of like local organizations and local government in general is, especially as you're involved in some different programs that are more national and federal.
Right, yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, I'll just say on that front that I do think local organizations, community-based organizations, and local elected officials are close enough to communities to have, first of all, direct relationships, and second of all, a more sort of felt sense of what the culture and needs of their communities are that you're just not going to get as you scale up solution making, to the federal level, which again is not to say that the federal government doesn't have an important role in some of the problems we deal with, but I think that community level organizations can serve as effective intermediaries, including in cultural and social conflicts, and indeed, Braver Angels is just such an organization. And I do want to take just a quick moment to sort of empathize a bit with what you're expressing at the top of your question. When somebody kind of leads with their identity, there's a way in which they're saying, we're about to talk about something that I'm the only person in the conversation who's qualified to have sort of, a credible opinion on. And even if you think that's true, that's not the way to go about having conversations. And I do want to correct, in light of that, I want to correct something in the bio introduction, Jeff, because you mentioned the fact that I'm, have a degree from El Camino College. Actually, I have no college degree. I have a high school diploma. And I think I'm still about 6 or 7 credits away from that associate's. But at this point, I think
That's
I'm
not
just
an
going
argument
to.
for college, is
I think
it?
I'm just going to forego it. Now, I'm not encouraging you fine young folks to drop out of an excellent institution like college. But what I am saying is that, as a younger person, I went through much of my life having people tell me that the studying that I had done on my own time didn't really mean much because even though they couldn't respond to my arguments, they had a degree and I didn't, therefore I lose, And it's sort of this thing where in society, broadly speaking, we have a difficult time reckoning with the substance of what people are saying and therefore reckoning with the intrinsic importance of character in our conversations because we collapse human value to labels and accreditation. And that's just a broader sort of social pattern that we have to end.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, my name is Ava, and I'm a freshman this year. My question goes back to what you said on agency. I've heard it said a lot in conversations about racial reconciliation that grief is a necessary step. How would you say we are supposed to grieve in a way that promotes agency and not a mindset of being a victim? And then how would you say we are to do that practically? I feel like that's something we say a lot, but we don't really define in terms of like racism and racial healing.
What was this? Wait, say the second part of the question.
How would you say we are to practically grieve? Like, what does that look like? I think we just say that a lot and we don't define it.
Well, interesting. So how do we practically grieve in situations, for example, where there may have been a racial incident, and right?
Yeah, like slavery, just the past of America's history of being racist and towards black people.
Right. Well, I mean, as it relates to our history, I think there's room for common recognition that, again, not all of America's past, or there are many elements of America's past that were atrocious and reason for grieving, and yet there's also lots of America's past where, hundreds of thousands of white soldiers died in the Civil War. Again, we can go into lots of details on history, but this is the thing that it always seems that there's got to be a special recognition, particularly as it relates to race, and there is a special history in the United States. That said, slavery has been a human condition of virtually every nation, and we have slavery today. Let's go to China or many other places around the world where it's still happening. That doesn't dismiss what has occurred in the United States. So, a grieving, gosh, it's so difficult. I thought where you were going with grieving was in contemporary instances where you'll have like a George Floyd, right? Where this is a horrific incident. Everyone in the country is quote unquote going through this cathartic experience, and yet there are about, I forget the exact numbers, but there are thousands of black men, for example, being killed or hurt every day in our, not every day, but over the course of the year. Huge numbers, and yet we're not grieving. It seems that we have selective humanity when it seems to involve the right characters based on a dominant narrative. And I feel if we were to share these kinds of grievings when any human being is suffering, that's how I think we will recognize our common humanity. It's not only when these are these terrible incidents that dominate the headlines for weeks and weeks and weeks, because that again, it's sort of selective and almost in a sense performative. It's almost like this sort of obligatory, non-authentic grieving. And that might be harsh to say, but again, where I run schools, I mean, there are a lot of incidents that never make the nightly news. And like, where are all the people, like, Black Lives Matter as an organization, seem to only be interested in instances where black lives are lost at the hands of people that they purport to be racist. So I guess I would try to, honor the common humanity always, versus just seemingly getting upset when there are these high-profile incidents.
Cool. That was a good question, yeah. We've got about 10-15 minutes left, and I'd like to get all the questions into the students that we have here. Boom. Keep them to like 2-minute answers.
Yes.
Great.
Okay.
By the way, the Hope students, just like our sports teams, are vastly outperforming Calvin.
There you go. And we'll go back and forth.
Sure.
Go ahead, Jonah.
So my question is, my name's Jonah Hill. I'm a sophomore, and my question is, what value do you guys see in perhaps identifying with your immutable characteristics, like your race or your gender? Oh, when you move closer, what value is there in identifying with your race or your gender? Are there any values, or would you say it's mostly negative, or what are the values, if there are some?
Mm-hmm. I'll go first on that. I mean, look, I think that the truth is that I can hardly think of anybody who identifies with their immutable characteristics as a mere kind of intrinsic, self-sufficient, a priori demonstration of their value, unconnected with the larger context of culture and history and shared struggle, right? And so what I mean by that is that when people say, I'm proud of being black, part of what you're saying is that, not just that like, oh, my skin is so great, look at me, it's more like I'm a part of this larger tradition in which, we have, speaking collectively, we have survived slavery, we have, fought through, racist oppression, the hands of the Klan, we've endured systemic racism and so forth, and we're still here, raising our families, building a culture, building a life, generation after generation, and the language of race becomes sort of the thickening kind of, rhetorical glue, if you will, that allows us to quickly identify with each other, setting up sort of cultural sort of parameters around the unique sort of, population and traditions that have emerged within that context. And so social cohesion is a vital thing. I mean, this is what gives context and thickness to our lives, the social connections. Now, none of that nullifies the sort of reductive impact of racial terminology in terms of, causing us to essentially, begin to define other people in opposition to our own racial categories in ways that reduce their human complexity because we want to elevate our own, right? So, we've spent much of the evening talking about the downsides of it, but no, I don't think we want to lose sight of the elemental reason for such language in the first place. It situates us in the context of culture and community and history, and those things are not bad things.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hi there, my name is Tristan, and I'm an education major, and I was wondering as to some ideas or ways in which we can apply what you're talking about tonight into our classrooms, especially in a public school setting.
Apply these ideas in the classroom?
Yes, like as future teachers.
Yeah, well, hopefully in the classroom, and this is where professors create...
He's one of my students.
Oh, right, okay. Well, often what I find is that the nature of democratic discourse, or whether viewpoint diversity is really respected, is the environment that you are in, and whether or not someone can say, well, I'm X, and I'm the only person that can speak on this topic, and so if you're Y, shut your mouth. The only time that is allowed is if the person facilitating the conversation doesn't allow that, right? That says, look, we are all of equal value in this conversation. So I would put the onus on in a classroom setting, because we very much try to do this with our own teachers. I mean, in the network of schools I'm launching in August, an exercise that every prospective teacher has to do as part of the application process, they have to watch a debate. So I did a debate on critical race theory on C-SPAN, which I think I won. But it's in my view, a very constructive dialogue around a contentious topic. And so every prospective teacher has to watch this, and then as part of the interview process, what's your reaction to this? How would you create this kind of dialogue in the classroom? How would you facilitate these conversations so people aren't demonized, but that you're allowing people to express their opinions, disagree if necessary? So in a classroom, I would say that hopefully at the beginning of the year, you as a class, another thing we're going to do in our school is something called the Good Society, where we're going to go away in a retreat and we're going to read all sorts of incredible books about how you create new social norms for a group. And I think every classroom should go through that kind of exercise for how is it that we're going to disagree with each other? What are the norms? What are the ways in which we operate? Do we have cell phones in our classroom? When someone's speaking, do we all turn and look at the speaker? I mean, these seem like simple things, but they're all actually small indications of respect for how you operate with each other.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Charity Ehrman. I'm a dual enrollment student. I was wondering how, when you create a curriculum, you decide what parts are most important and which parts to leave in, and then which parts to leave out, and then from that, what you hope that students will take away.
Yeah, great question. So I mentioned that we, in response to the 1619 project, which we thought was overly focused on very negative aspects of American history, we created something in response called the 1776 Unites curriculum. And it's an interesting question. We didn't start by just, like I mentioned, the Tulsa Massacre. We started with a set of principles: agency, resiliency, courage. So we had a set of guiding principles that we knew we wanted to tell stories that represented each one of these principles. And so we started to identify characters in particular African American history that we thought were not well known. So for example, Booker T. Washington is someone who's relatively well known in African American history, but many people don't know that he, in partnership with Julius Rosenwald during Jim Crow segregation, when education for black kids was horrific, that they partnered together to build nearly 5,000 schools through the American South. And the levels of academic achievement during that period was extraordinary. And ironically, the demise of the Rosenwald schools, these nearly 5,000 schools, was triggered by the Supreme Court decision of Brown versus Board of Education, which deemed that separate education by race is inherently unequal and therefore inferior, so the Rosenwald schools were deemed unconstitutional and had to close. We decided that was an important story because A, it's not very well known, it aligned with the ideals of resiliency and courage that we were trying to highlight in these stories. So essentially, we set up a framework where what are the key sort of enduring ideas that we want every unit to be aligned with, and then with the specifics, we said, how well is it already known? Is this a story that should be told and taught? And so that's kind of how we went about that process.
Hello, my name is Ayana, and I'm a freshman. And my question was based on the conversation around, I guess, kids being put in a box when they were being told, like, you're from a marginalized group and so on. But how do you balance between educating young children on, like, their race and the background of that race, but also giving them the space to, I guess, develop their own personal identity that's detached from that in some sense? I don't know what that, yeah.
Did you hear the full question?
So the question is, how do you educate kids in a way that allows them to reckon with sort of the history and the context of race while also allowing them to develop their own attitudes, right?
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. Well, you're the educator, that's a good one for you.
Well, what's interesting is that, again, I run schools in the heart of the South Bronx. Almost all of our kids are Black or Hispanic. And frankly, I try not to dwell obsessively about race. I mean, I listened to a podcast the other day. These 4 Black guys, they have a podcast called The 8 Black Hands, and they're kind of seen as, they're the authority because they're all 4 Black guys, and only they can talk about race and education. And they did a whole episode on this idea that every kid needs to learn about white power. Literally, that was the full focus of this podcast. I'm like, really? You're going to have a whole session on white power? As if, well, I thought that was not a good use of instructional time. Let's put it that way. That, again, at our school, at our elementary school, one of the things that we became good at, our boys' school, was that they became spelling bee champions. It was great, Boys Prep Bronx spelling bee team. And when you asked our boys how they identified themselves, they didn't say Black, they didn't say I'm a boy, they said I'm a member of Boys Prep Bronx and I'm a spelling bee champion. And so you create opportunities for achievement that transcend these characteristics. And so that's how you do it. Again, it's not you spend all day talking about your race, you spend all day talking about how special you can be by being a math champion or any other set of outcomes, because you are more complex than just your race. I know that's how we try to do it. And to the degree that race is relevant, we never want to create the impression that because of your race, you're somehow inherently less than. Because I often feel that that's what, when it comes to subjects of race, that's where people go, and I just try to fight that.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hello, my name's Abigail, and I'm a freshman here. My question was, what are your opinions on Black pride and identity, or pride in what people may say as your primary identity, that people kind of see? Considering your remarks on labels and the fact that they should be removed, or not completely removed, but that labels shouldn't be so important in education, in life, and in how we carry ourselves.
Yep.
So what is the opinion on Black pride?
Or just celebration of certain identities. Yeah.
Right, versus de-emphasizing labels. Well, first of all, thank you, Abigail, and Abigail is my favorite name because that's my daughter's name. And so it's a pleasure to meet you. And so let me give a little bit of a twist on this. very, very much agreeing with my brother Ian, just so much on the excesses, I do want to say that I was, I remember during the 2016 campaign, I did the primary, while Jeb Bush was still in the race, I was fairly uninspired by Jeb Bush's, campaign. I seem to be one of the few people who never thought that Jeb was likely to get off the ground just because he had a lot of money, but he wasn't inspiring anybody. But my favorite moment with Jeb during his primary campaign was an appearance on Meet the Press where Chuck Todd asked him for some reason. He said, "What was the first music concert you can ever remember going to?" And Jeb Bush said, he said, "I went to see James Brown, perform at so and such a place." And then Jeb Bush said, "Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud." And I was like, go on, Jeb. And see, the thing is, my friend Rakeem Brooks, Ian, he has this concept of emancipatory identity, where, I'm sure that, Rakeem would sort of say, he takes black pride as a positive thing, but what he would say is that through my black identity, I have a particular window to the larger human experience. And so, for him, he channels kind of the subjective experience of African Americans as something that he owns and has a special relationship to, but that also is kind of a bridge to understanding the equivalently deep sort of experiences of other human beings. And so it's really, sort of a matter of how that manifests in you, I would say. Martin Luther King Jr. had deep problems with the Black Power slogan and with the ethos that produced it and ultimately would sort of go on to define much of the mainstream of civil rights activism. But what Dr. King also said was that the appeal of Black Power was clear and something that found some sympathy with him insofar as it gave rhetorical tools for people who had felt their humanity and their manhood as being marginalized across history, a means for being able to stand tall in their own skins, sort of literally, right? To be able to say that they no longer were going to think of themselves as lesser, and they were going to take an identity that had been foisted upon them as a negative and lift it up as a positive, something that would allow them to convey their own dignity in language that they were now taking control of, So, these things are always more complicated than they seem on the surface. I would just ask the question, what do you mean by that? So there you go.
That's always a great question to ask, by the way. Well, I'd like to thank Hope students for their terrific questions. I'd like to thank the audience for coming tonight and joining us in this presentation, and I'd like to ask all of you to join me in thanking our two panelists.
All right, excellent.
You're dismissed.